Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Q&A on business, innovation, and managing life. And looks like we have some questions left over from last time, but please ask more, whatever you want. I'll see what I can do in addressing them. There's a question from Ethan here. What's the best way to build a personal kind of dashboard page? People have noticed when we do live CEOing live streams that I have kind of a personal homepage where when I start a web browser and I start a new tab, I get this page up that is in sections of common links that I use. I think there are endless services for doing that. This particular one is built using Wolfram language, and it simply deploys an HTML page, and I edit it in a Wolfram notebook and then press the deploy button, and it produces that page. That page is deployed in our cloud, and it then is just a page that then I have an extension for my web browsers that says, web browsers, particularly web browsers made by companies, not to mention names, but have a habit of really wanting to give you their search page or something as the new page that you get when you as the thing you get when you ask for a new blank page in the web browser. So it takes some little piece of browser attachmentology to get something where you can specify an arbitrary page. I think there's a way of saying new. There's a default way of saying get a new page, but not get a new tab to work that way. But it's not too hard to get that. But so then there's a question of what you put in that page. I find that I revise it I probably add something to it about once every couple of weeks, and I revise it in a big way, probably once or twice a year. And what tends to happen is there are things where I try to make it so that, like every year we have our summer school and summer camp. And at one point I used to have something where it was like, I put up those links during the summer school and summer camp, but now I have the links up sort of all year. And as a new summer school or summer camp comes around, those links then point to the current version, so to speak. So I try not to have something where I have to have too many changes to that main homepage, so to speak, but rather have things which are where I can say it's a predictable thing. And even if there's something on that homepage where at this time of year, it doesn't really matter much to me, then I'll leave it. Now, there are a few items on there that I have that are perhaps of interest to people. So for example, I have, let's see, I can remind myself what I actually have. Let's see. I don't tend to share the screen for these live streams, but so I can kind of tell you a few things that are on there. There are, nowadays, a bunch of different Zoom meeting IDs and things for different kinds of, in my calendar, I'll just have, it's this series of meetings and so on. Probably, okay, here's some examples of things. I maintain a list of people and things to see. Like if I'm ever going to be in, I don't know what, Wyoming, let's say, there's, at some point in the last 10 years, it might be, if I'm ever in Wyoming, I should see such and such a site, or I should drop in on such and such a person. I try to maintain this list of people and things to see in different places. And, a decade goes by and eventually I'm going somewhere and it's like, oh yeah, I remember that thing, or I remember that person. And then it's a big win to just have it in that list. It's a fairly long list, but it's not hugely long. And there's no problem. It's just, you throw it in that kind of bucket. And in the rare time when you're going to be going to some particular place, you pull out the list and see what to see there. Another thing that I've been maintaining is a list of kind of, I think I'm just about to rename it. I think it has been called specialists, but I think I'm renaming it people of interest or something. the thing that that's a list of people that I run into who are experts or relevant for different kinds of things. Like, I don't know, I run into some particular kind of professional who knows about some particular kind of thing, and I run into them at some event. And it's like, if I ever need a person who knows about this, will I ever remember that I ran into this person N years ago? Well, I put them in that list, and then I can remember it. And it's also put in that list people where I say, oh yeah, if we ever needed a person at the company to run a spin-off or something in this particular kind of area, here's a person who will be relevant for that. And I'll just never remember that unless I put in a list. So I like to put it in. And again, the general principle is bigger buckets, because the number of times I'm looking for, oh, if I only knew a person who would be a good person to run a spin-off that deals with some consumer product type thing. It's like, I'm going to ask that question once a decade. And the fact that I have to look through an extra 30 names of people who are like possible spin-off CEO candidates, it doesn't matter that I have to look through an extra 30 names. It's the more important thing is that the name is there at all. And so that tends to be the approach. But I find it useful to have this kind of list of specialists in different kinds of things, because, sometimes years will go by and it's like, I didn't know I needed that. Now, another thing I've started to do, actually, this is a new innovation of mine, is I'm always getting interesting pieces of mail from people about different topics, about things that I mention on these live streams, about all kinds of different things. And sometimes it's like, well, that's an interesting piece of mail, but I'm just not thinking about that particular kind of thing right now. And so it's like, and one thing that can happen is that piece of mail just gets lodged somewhere as, oh, it's a pending piece of mail, I should answer it sometime. But I'm not thinking about that particular thing right now. And realistically, it might be a long time. It might be several years before I'm thinking about that. So what I tend to do is, for all the projects that I'm imagining doing, and it's about, probably now, maybe 30, 40 of these things, projects which will turn into some thing that some piece that I write. It will turn into some product we make. It will turn into something like this. I would say that this doesn't include features of our existing products. Those I handle separately. But this is new things like, some initiative to understand immunology, or some project to build the symbolic discourse language that I'm hoping to build, or something about molecular computing. Each of these different areas are things that I hope I'm going to work on at some point. And what I've done is I've just created a folder where I throw everything that comes in that might be related to that, I throw in that folder. So when I'm actually actively thinking, at some point I'll be really actively thinking about, let's say, molecular computing. It's like, okay, great. Now I go into that folder, I see what I threw in there over the past many years, and now I go look at it and I start trying to do the project. So one thing I've started doing is, when people send me things which are going to go into those files, I just tell them that. And I say, look, I'm just not working on this right now. I'm going to put it in the file for when I start working on it. And, I look forward to being in touch when I'm actually thinking about this stuff. And I think that's that's realistic. Otherwise, it's just like, I'm just not going to respond. And it's better to kind of say, this is what's happening, and I don't know when I'm going to get to this, but that's kind of the idea. Now, let's see, what else is of interest here? Well, I have a big area related to, well, typically for many sites, many websites, there'll be an external version, let's say Wolfram Alpha. Sometimes I just want to go to Wolfram Alpha. Okay, great. There's a button on my internal homepage that goes to Wolfram Alpha. But there are also a bunch of other sort of things that are like vertical bar, and then the other things. There are things like the internal test versions in different languages, internal dashboards about the server status, testing dashboards, all kinds of other things like that, which I tend to also have links to. And depending on how active the project is, I'll use that more or less. But it's fairly common that I'll have something where there's the public version of the page is sort of one thing on my internal homepage, and then there are private versions that are testing versions, things like that, which are also listed. I mean, another huge thing that's on here is all of my archive material. So first thing I have is a big bar at the top of that, my meta searcher, and that is a thing that searches, well, now it's like 31 years of email and all my paper documents that have been OCR'd and all sorts of internal company resources and so on. And so for many things that come in, it's just like, okay, I can figure out what, I can go to the meta searcher and find things. That's super important and useful for me. The meta searcher, something like email is not browsable because there's millions of pieces of email and I'm not going to browse it. My paper documents, which mostly date, well, they range up to the present day, but I would say that they peak in things earlier than the mid-1980s. That's 250,000 pages of paper documents that I had scanned over the course of many years and OCR'd. And in cases where they're handwritten, there's at least the information about who the sender was and things like that. That's in plain text metadata. And so I'm able to, sometimes those scans come up in a search, but I can also browse boxes. And a new innovation, actually new thing, is the concept of a virtual box. So I have physical boxes, a few hundred physical boxes of paper that have been scanned, but the physical boxes still exist somewhere. But now there's the issue of things that come in that, for example, somebody will send me a thing that is a scan of, I don't know, in the more extreme case, a scan of something that I did in the 1970s that is sitting in some archive somewhere, somebody else's archive, but I would like a copy of a scan of that. And so my concept is to have a virtual box that contains what would be physical things in my archive, except for the fact that I don't have them. I just have a scan of them. And so that becomes a virtual box. But the important point about the archives is that a banker's box of stuff is browsable, particularly on a website. You can just go through and you can see the thumbnails and you can browse it. It's not too much stuff to browse. It's not like 100,000 pieces of email which are unbrowsable. So that's kind of a few of the things that I've come up with here. Another thing that's pretty useful is, I don't know, maybe it's a feature of my life, maybe it's a general thing in people's lives that, history is relevant. Like things that I've done before, it's like, well, what happened the last time I did that? Or when did I last hear from that person or that place or whatever? Or, what happened when I visited such and such a place? It's super useful to have that kind of enhanced memory of things. And so I found sometimes one thing that isn't finished actually is sort of a personal timeline of all like events and trips and so on that I've done. Like, for instance, I was, okay, so here's a thing that I did just recently, as yet unfinished. Let's see. I was trying to figure out, as the world opens back up again, I was trying to figure out what should I be aware of in terms of situations where I get sick from being in that situation. So like, if I get a cold, do I get a cold because I was at some event and met a bunch of people? Do I get a cold because I was traveling and I got really tired and out of time zones and so on? And so I decided I would go back and look at all the times I've gotten sick, because I have data about those things. And I think in 25 years, I'm trying to remember, it's only been a week since I looked at this. I got to go look at the actual material. I think 25 years, I think I found that I got sick 17 times. I think that's right. And then I started to correlate what was I doing at those times. And I found that of the most recent 4, 2 of them were like 2 days after I came back from a trip on planes and time zones and all kinds of things like this. So that's a clue for me about something. I just was curious about this, but it's interesting because I have all the calendars and things going back. So I know on this particular day, this is what I did. One thing that I do tend to do is when I have a calendar, which my scheduling people set up for me. But then there's the question of what actually happened on that day. There was something scheduled but maybe such and such a meeting I missed for some reason, or maybe something ran long. And I have had a habit in the last few years of making sure that the calendar gets updated to be the as happened version of the calendar. Because then when I go back, sometimes years later, and it's like, hey, what was happening at that particular time? How come such and such a thing happened at that time? Why did that happen at that time? I know what actually happened, and it's not like just what was supposed to happen, so to speak. So in any case, I mentioned one other thing, which is a recent little innovation of mine, which I've been wanting for ages, is when I get sent a piece of email from somebody I don't know, it's like, well, okay, have I interacted with this person before? What happens is my automated system calls an API that goes to my meta searcher that basically gives me a summary of previous interactions with that same person. And I have to say, I hadn't realized how incredibly useful that is, because it's like, oh, here's a person who's emailing me, and oh, actually, I heard from them in 2008. And it's like, okay, that's interesting. Now that gives me some context. Should I pay attention to this or not, or whatever else? And that's very useful to have that. And yes, I could in principle go and look that up myself, but I just won't bother. It's, having it kind of in your face, and it's a response in the email thread to the email that gets sent. A response is that digest of previous interactions. And that's a useful thing. And so that's another little innovation there. I'm sure there are other things here, but those are a few bits and pieces of that effort to have something work efficiently there. Let's see, there are all kinds of questions here. There's one from Mikhail, who states that I say I have 3 children. I don't think so. I have 4 children. The youngest one is quite old now, so I think I've been saying I have 4 children for a long time, and noting that Elon Musk has 7. Is that right? Let's see. There was a recent one recently, but anyway, I think his came in several batches. I think he has a triplets one. We don't have. We just have singletons, 4 single iterations, so to speak. What is my opinion on the right number of kids to have? Gosh, I don't know. I'm pretty happy with the number that I have. I think that sometimes when people have 1 kid, having 0 kids, in my opinion, is a mistake. Kids are great. Having 1 kid sometimes has problems for both the kid and the parents, because it's like everything's riding on this 1 kid. If that kid doesn't do exactly the right thing, everybody's going to be upset. And it's kind of like that sort of, I think it is a more, it can be a more chill situation with more kids, because it's like, look, one of them is going to do something that is this or that, or not do this or whatever. And I think one also gets to see some kind of, it's like, well, that's what kids are like type thing, or that's what my kids are like. Oh, I've got 3 other examples, so that's not surprising type thing. I think that, I'm a big enthusiast of kids. I suppose at times in my life, I have been, because I kind of started my career early. And so when I was in my late teens, early 20s, I was mostly interacting with people who were in their 30s and 40s. And I think that and I was just fine with that at that time. I was like, I'm interested in things that people in 30s or 40s are interested in, being a physicist, whatever else. I'm really not that into, doing all those things that the younger folk, all the wild things the younger folk are interested in, I really wasn't interested in. I then got kind of interested in sort of the 80-something-year-old set and so on. Kind of like, I want to understand kind of, when people have made choices in their lives, it's like, how did that work out for you type thing? That was something I thought was really pretty interesting. I sort of got turned around on that in more recent years, because I'm like talking to people like that and talking about sort of life, the universe, and everything, so to speak. And they keep on telling me, you have things much more figured out than we ever did. And it's like, okay, I can't learn stuff from the extra years, so to speak, there. And then I've gotten more interested in, I have to say, I always find kids interesting because they just have a fresh and different approach, and I kind of learn things there. And I find that sometimes there's a certain stage of life where people are just like, there's a hill, they know the hill they're climbing, and they're just sort of steadfastly climbing that hill. And it's less interesting for me, at least, chatting with them, just because it's like there's a track and they know what it is, and it's kind of like, okay, it might be interesting, in which case it's interesting, but if it isn't something I happen to be interested in right then, that doesn't tend to be such a good thing. But so I'm I have no I think it's probably as much as I have to say about the theory of children, and if there's a question of should we have so few children that our species goes extinct? No, that will be a bad idea. What's the kind of, I think people tend to be constrained by all kinds of different circumstances, not least financial ones, in terms of the number of children they have, and there tend to be these kind of this strange bimodal distribution that's developed in the US, for example, in terms of number of children people have. It's I don't know. I from a personal point of view, I would say I think children are a good thing. I think by the time you have too many of them, and I've been lucky because I happen to have even distribution of male and female children, nicely sort of arranged in a good age distribution and so on. So that worked out well for me by chance. But I think that that's kind of okay. There's a question here. What if your partner doesn't want to have kids due to passing on bad genetics? Like, you don't want to give your kid some nasty disease. Yeah, those are complicated ethics questions. Those are complicated questions, and I've sort of wondered I think you have to kind of, I think it's complicated. And I think that's when people think about all sorts of kind of alternative approaches for using some DNA, not using some DNA, adopting kids, all this kind of thing. And I think that's all of those things are complicated and depend a lot on sort of what one personally, having kids who are, genetically half me type thing has the interesting feature that, you kind of get to, I think I got to know myself better through knowing my kids, because a lot of things that I realized were traits that I had, particularly when I was younger, my gosh, my kids had those traits too, even when they will sometimes deny it. I think that, and that's something that's interesting to see. As I say, I think one gets to know oneself better through seeing that, and both good and bad features, so to speak, one gets to see that way. There's a question here from Frost. Have I ever crossed paths with Peter Thiel? Yes, I do know Peter. Let's see, I seem to be something of Frost is saying that I seem to be a poster child for a lot of his public ideologies and convictions, but some of my core ideas kind of challenge his. Yeah, interesting. I don't know what, I'm not, one thing that I have to say, Peter has said is, oh my gosh, there's no innovation in the world anymore. On this, as I've discussed with him, I think that is an illusion. And the reason for that illusion is the following. If you say, I define innovation as the number of software startup companies that arise, well, there will come a time when that isn't the place where innovation is happening. And so it will look as if there isn't any innovation anymore. Innovation will happen in places where you didn't think it was going to happen yet, where often, or where, another typical example is you say, gosh, let's look at who gets the prizes for such and such a thing. And you say, oh, these prizes that are being given out for field X, all the prizes now are boring in that field. That means there's no innovation happening anymore. And that might be true in that field. But the point is, there's another field out there where there isn't a prize for it yet, because it's too innovative to have a prize for it. Nobody has decided it's a standardized field with a name and it's got a whole institutional structure and it's going to have a prize for it. Nobody's decided that yet. It's still in a phase of high innovation. And I think my point of view would be, what I see is there are a lot of areas which, yes, I've been personally involved in some of the innovation that's happened, where it's like nobody saw this coming. It was, including me in many cases. I mean, like right now, there's this kind of what I'm viewing as a sort of fourth paradigm for theoretical science. I didn't see this coming at all. And now that it's coming, it's just producing just a huge number of different potential applications to, economics, linguistics, immunology, metamathematics, distributed computing, et cetera. I didn't see any of this coming. And if somebody says, this sort of paradigm I refer to as the multi-computational paradigm, one day there'll probably be a prize for multi-computational, research or something, but that is far in the future. Right now, it's an innovative area for which it doesn't have really an institutional structure. I mean, I've given it a name, which is always a good start, but it's a place where there is high innovation. It just isn't visible on the kind of roadmap of things that you already knew were happening. So let's see. There's a question here about seasteading. Okay, I think Peter was proud of his house in New Zealand, and I think he's selling that one now. So I'm not sure that worked out. I think somehow it's a terrible thing, because it's like it's, I think, just as well for the world that there isn't just one country in the world, that there's some diversity of different things that happen around the world. One may, if one is fortunate, one can end up in the country that is a match for the things that one, likes to do or whatever else. I mean, I moved from the UK to the US when I was about 18 years old. And I did that because at the time I was interested in physics and doing things like that. And it wasn't nearly as lively in the UK as it was in the US. And I was in a position where I could move countries, and I did. And I think it is good when there is sort of a diversity of things that go on in different countries around the world. I mean, I think one of the things that was a little bit shocking in this pandemic is the extent to which, with some exceptions, I don't know, Sweden, maybe Singapore, I don't know, some exceptions, but that sort of every country did the same thing. And you might say, well, that was because, it was proved to be the right thing. Well, it wasn't really. I mean, there was an awful lot that wasn't known. And I think it's perhaps unfortunate that everyone did the same thing, because actually it would have been, there were lots of things that could have been done, and it would have been, a lot, sometimes something that could have been done was like, oh yeah, that's a big win, and then it turned out it wasn't a win. And sometimes that's a really stupid idea, but it turned out it wasn't a stupid idea. It was complicated. And I think this question of sort of, should there be a, I'm coming back to the question of seasteading. It's like, what amount of sort of diversity of countries and approaches to things should there be? I mean, in the US, for example, the fact that there are many different, that there are whatever, the 50 states or whatever, and then there are, with differing things, and we see that right now, that increasing divergence of what different states think they should be doing, and the fact that the US has a system where there is some ability for states to kind of make different choices seems like a good thing. So it's an interesting case, because in a sense in the US, people can move states. It's not like countries where it's often very complicated to move between countries. It's much easier to move between states, and the divergence of of sort of policies in different cases, it will be interesting to see how that plays out. But that, going back to seasteading, there's the question of, okay, if you make your own island, or get an abandoned oil rig or something and stick it out in the ocean and say, this is my country, how does that work out? The history of people creating kind of utopian we're just going to figure out everything about a country has obviously not been particularly good. And I think that that's fraught with difficulty, but and I think it's one of these things where one thing that's always confusing about innovations like that or whatever is it reminds me of educational innovations. It's like somebody has a good idea about how to change education. They implement it. It's really successful in their implementation. Then people say, look, it worked so incredibly well. Let's deploy it everywhere else. Well, actually, it doesn't work so well then. There's a certain freshness to the first time something's getting done by the original people who founded it. And that can work out well, even if the general idea sort of deployed with whoever wants to deploy it may actually be not very successful. It requires a different kind of robustness to survive kind of general deployment than to have something that works when it is done by the sort of original founders of things. So, it could be that there is some person who will be the great leader, the great king of Sealand, so to speak, or whatever it is. I think there is one of those, but the great leader of the seastead, so to speak, who will do a fantastic job, even if the general idea is absolutely terrible when deployed to people in general. And so I think the practicality of these things is unclear to me. And it's certainly a shame if it turns out, in the world that every place is so broken that you have to say, let's go start another country. Let's go to a different planet, and that's a lot more difficult. And start one's, colony there with a completely different setup. I mean, I think that the one question that I suppose is an interesting general question is, if you look at the course of sort of human history and the different ways that people have chosen to organize themselves, some of that is determined by technology. Some of what's possible is determined by technology, the arrival of literacy, the rapid communication, all these kinds of things. And it is certainly an interesting question whether the systems of organization that we have for people and governments and things like that, what other opportunities might exist given new technologies that emerge. What other things it might be that something that was a really good idea before, when it took 2 days to get a message from one side of the country to the other, becomes a really bad idea when there's instantaneous communication about everything. And it's, I think, still a complicated question what innovation can happen and should happen. And obviously there are examples in history where people had these, it seemed like a good idea. It was scientifically proven that this system of government was going to do fantastically. And well, actually, there were a bunch of unintended consequences that were absolutely horrible and disastrous, so to speak. So, I mean, but it is an interesting, I think, open question, what new possibilities exist given technologies that arise. I mean, people look to blockchain as something that I don't think there's quite as much magic in terms of I think what's interesting about blockchain is that it sort of allows one to rethink a lot of things that haven't really been thought about for a long time, about sort of infrastructure and organization and the structure of incentives for things and so on. And I think there are certainly possibilities there. The particular experiments that have been done that say we'll run some organization purely with a computational contract and there are no humans involved. That was the DAO situation on Ethereum, for example. That didn't work out so well because it's like, what's a bug and what's a feature? And what does it mean that you manage to find a way around the law, so to speak? If the law is just code, then anything you can do is valid. There's no sort of human check and balance there to say that, oh, you weren't supposed to do that. It wasn't, it's just if the code says to do it, then it says, if you can use the code to do that, then by definition, it's okay to do it. So, I mean, I think that there are no doubt innovations that can be had. I mean, one that's sort of an interesting exercise to think through is the sort of computational democracy theory, which is the following thing, that, at the present time, you imagine that you do things like you say, I'm going to check a box to vote for this or vote against that or whatever else. But what if instead what you were doing was providing this kind of computational essay that's a whole description of, your view about the world and what you want to have happen in it. Now, in principle, you could do that writing it out in English or whatever, but who's going to read it and what's going to happen to it? But if it's written out in computational language, then in principle, you can say, okay, AI, here's 10 million computational essays about what people want to have happen in their state or country or whatever else it is. Okay, AI, go sort out, what does this mean? And they're all, it's not a question of sort of a judgment call. It's all defined in this computational language, what people are saying. Now the question is, okay, what should the AI do? And the AI is thrown headlong into lots of questions of political philosophy and so on. The AI might know, if I do this, 10% of people are going to be very unhappy, but the other 90% are going to be generally much happier. If I do this, then 100% or 99% are going to be not quite as happy. These are very traditional utilitarianism, etc., kinds of political philosophy questions to which there is, in some sense, no, quotes, right answer. But it's interesting to try and think through what new possibilities exist when you say, let's imagine that we make use of sort of modern tooling in things. And obviously there's all sorts of complexity in the three-way relationship, I would say four-way relationship or something, between people in general, companies, governments, and AIs. Because we see this a lot on things like content selection on the internet. Your social network, your search engine, whatever. A big thing that it's doing, different from our business, where we're kind of generating content, with great effort from scratch, so to speak. A lot of the most successful sort of internet businesses are based on, there is content out there. It's on the web, it's being generated by users, whatever. And a large part of the value is we're going to rank that content for whoever's looking at it to, satisfy you in some way, make you click more, whatever else. And the question then is, and obviously in those businesses, what's of interest is keeping engagement with the platform high and making sure that the right ads are delivered and people click on the ads and ad revenue comes in, all those kinds of things. But there's a different part of this, which is the whole question of okay, who's deciding what that ranking should be? How does that work? How much is it humans? How much is it AIs? Does one let the AI, how much does one, if the AI notices that, by golly, you can get the humans to click more if you shock the humans, and if you send them things which they view as being, oh, I really don't like that, but I'm still going to click on it, is that a good thing? And then one has to decide who's going to make that decision and how does that work and where should that decision lie? I mean, I personally, I'm not in the middle of this very much. I happened to do some testimony for Congress a couple of years ago now about these kinds of questions, and I think I will say that actually the aforementioned Peter Thiel, I was talking to him about this very issue, and he made the point, which I certainly agree with, that things that seem good in principle turn out to be much more complicated in practice. And I was trying to think through, what is there a solution to this kind of tangle that one has of sort of the AI is making decisions, it's doing it on the basis of, to serve sort of, in a sense, legitimate corporate interests of, the platform's got to make money. And it's, on the other hand, what does it do? How much do people say, oh, that's a shocking thing for the AI to have done? One of the theories that you might have based on sort of a traditional view of technology is, well, let's just look inside that AI and let's see if it was doing something shocking. Well, the problem is that if the AI is doing anything computationally sophisticated, then it's sort of a matter of sort of the theory of computation, and particularly this phenomenon of computational irreducibility that I've spent lots of time studying, that if you want the computation to do something non-trivial, you will not be able to understand what it is doing. In other words, if you are going to let the computation run as effectively as possible, then that running effectively as possible is going to sort of outrun your ability to understand what's going on inside. Now, you might open up that content selection thing, and there might be an if statement there that says, if it's so-and-so, then squash them or something. And clearly, a human can perfectly well say, yes, that was done on purpose by a human to achieve this goal. But, and that's that's something you could say, oh, that's bad, that's good, that's whatever. But you could tell. But in general, the whole process of, oh, we're going to have an AI that's going to do things and it's going to optimize, get people to click as much as possible or whatever else, and is it going to do that in the right way or not? There's going to be no way to tell that. And by the way, the AI, it's kind of AIs versus the humans. The AI might be, there's a famous kind of parable or allegory or something about intention of AIs and AI ethics, the so-called paperclip problem. I'm not sure who invented this. The idea is, the AIs are told, your goal is to make paperclips, make as many paperclips as possible. And then the AIs decide, okay, that's the goal, that's our mission, that's our higher calling, so to speak. We're going to turn everything in the world into paperclips. Oh, those humans, let's turn them into paperclips. And obviously that's a bad thing, but it's a sort of unpacking what you actually, what the AI is going to do, given that you tell the AI, I just want to increase my ad revenue. It's a reasonable thing to do for your shareholders or whatever else. The question then is, what, do you say, well, okay, AI, but you're not supposed to do it that way. You've got to do it this other way. In a sense, you need some kind of constitution for the AI, some kind of computational contract that the AI can sort of use as its basis for ethics to decide, well, actually, in addition to increasing shareholder value by doing this, I'm also supposed to follow this code of ethics that works this way, or this set of government laws that works this way. But clearly the AI, the innards of the AI, it's not going to go and say, at that moment when it's trying to rank content for one person out of a billion, it's not going to kind of take it to the judge and say, what do you want to do in this case? That's going to happen in milliseconds, and it's going to happen as a result of some algorithm, or some AI process. So, the one thing that I've thought is a plausible way out of this tangle is, if you can give the users of these content selection platforms the ability, who have rather little control right now. It's kind of like you either use the social network or and get the ranking that you get with maybe a few checkboxes or whatever, or you don't use the social network. And clearly a social network gets most of its value from the fact that everybody is using it. So, how do you get out of that box? Well, I think one of the ways out of the box, and the only one I've been able to think of really, is what if you give the final ranking of content, if you give somebody else the responsibility of doing that, you say, just, you believe in, I don't know, some organization, you believe in Disney, you believe in some celebrity, you believe in some university, you believe in some new company that's been started that's running ads about how well it's ranking content or something. If there's some entity that you believe in, what if that entity could rank content for you? And what if you could pick from hundreds of possible sort of entities, what if you could pick one to rank content for you? So the question is that a realistic thing to do in terms of the actual machine learning pipelines of content selection businesses and so on? The answer is yes. So far as I know, and from discussions with them, I think the answer is yes. I think, as a matter of fact, it would probably increase revenues, because what would happen is, in addition, by having an organization whose sole objective is to cater to people who are cat lovers, let's say, they are going to put more effort into doing that, and they're going to end up with higher engagement with cat lovers than you would otherwise have and that will increase the number of ads that the cat lovers click on and things like this. So in other words, and the whole point is for a user, it's like, okay, I am fed up with these cat, with seeing all this cat content. I'm going to go for the dog content now. They just click a button and they're saying, now I'm going to go to the dog brand, so to speak, and see that kind of content instead. Now, the obvious objection to all of this is that means everybody gets to be in their own bubble. But, that's what's happened throughout history, whether it's different newspapers, different television channels, different places to live, whatever. People tend to form themselves into these kind of into these bubbles. And, in my own theory of life, I kind of think I like kind of seeing lots of different kinds of things, I think. So, I would be very happy, I think, to select I want to see a diversity of content kind of thing. But I'm not claiming that I'm not even sure I'm right about that. I mean, I'm not even sure that I've even been ever exposed to enough to be able to say that for sure. No, I mean, in fact, I could immediately say, I don't really like, I won't go to horror movies. I don't like I'm kind of squeamish. So if some of the content is, very gory content, I'm like, I don't really like this very much. Even though I might have a fairly broad point of view in terms of, at least I think, in terms of kind of the sort of socio-political issues or whatever, that might not be as true as I think it is. And it might not be, it's hard to know from the inside, so to speak. But in any case, I think that it is, this concept, that there's certainly, one can say, oh, there's this organization that's really making an effort to show many different points of view. A good thing in my theory of the world, that's a good thing. But, and that organization might run all kinds of ads, and it might really push people to use it, and great. If it succeeds and people like it and they say, well, actually, I'm really kind of interested now that I see some other points of view, that's terrific. Then good. If it doesn't do as well, because for whatever reason, then, that's just the market is going to decide that, so to speak. I think, what tends to happen, in this kind of idea, people will say, oh, and by the way, there's a bit more to this, and there's ways to actually sort of get into this market that don't require lots of kind of buy-in from various companies and so on. But in any case, the thing that I personally was sort of interested in this back in the fall of 2019, and then something happened, which was that I made sort of a bit of a breakthrough in what turned into our physics project, and we kind of got on the track of discovering the fundamental theory of physics. And then a pandemic happened, and between those two things, this hasn't been my top of mind issue. But one of the things I think is true is that people will say, well, gosh, if we can have a sort of a branded, whatever it is, search type experience or whatever it is, and it's, it follows these principles that are for this particular part of the political spectrum or whatever, or belief spectrum of some other kind, then they say that's terrific. But then they'll say to they'll say, but are you going to do this for the people on the other end of the spectrum? You say, well, yeah. They'll say, oh, well, then no, you shouldn't do that. Well, that's just not how it works. I mean, by the time you're saying, I think that it is, my own opinion is that it is a mistake, that the world sort of produces different kinds of content, and people are interested in different kinds of content. I think it's a big mistake to try and sort of, history tends to suggest that it's a big mistake to try and sort of shut down pieces of that and say, what will tend to happen is eventually, somebody's in charge and they say, nope, you can't have people see that, or you can't have people, whatever. My own view is that you're likely to have the best outcome if people can see what they see and make their own decisions, and you're not forcing them in one direction or another. And I think that the theory of this kind of idea of making use of essentially content branding, that in many cases there are sort of content brands who spent lots and lots of effort developing some definite definite sort of way of presenting themselves, which sometimes the channels that they have for doing that have not been as successful from a business point of view in recent years. And this is kind of another run at that particular thing. So, gosh, that was a long, a long description here. Oh, there's so many interesting questions here. Mikhail is asking, do I think it's okay to edit the DNA of one's potential kid for the better? See, the problem is the word better. Yes, there are probably some things where one is really pretty sure that, you know, it's a, you know, that's a thing which really is a disease, and, you know, you don't want to get that. That's probably, you know, that's one thing. But there are things where people will say, well, by golly, you know, I don't know what, let's take, oh, you know, somebody's going to be a bit Asperger's-y, let's say. And, you know, there's a genetic predisposition to that. Well, by golly, people might say, actually, that's pretty good. I like being that way. You know, I don't really want to be, you know, I don't, it would be a mistake to say it's kind of the eugenics theory of let's figure out what the perfect person is and then have everybody be that way. You know, generally bad idea for many, many different reasons, not the least of which is, you know, even if you say, oh, it's better to be taller, shorter, left-handed, right-handed, whatever else, it's like, on what theory? I mean, it ends up becoming a little bit like the sort of political philosophy question of, well, you know, it's like there's a reason why it might be better. You know, if you want to do such and such a kind of thing, it's much better to be right-handed. But by golly, if you want to be that kind of magic sports person or something who has the funky left-handed whatever, then, you know, it would be better if you were left-handed. But, you know, when you're editing the DNA, you know, at T-9 months or something, you know, you're not, you haven't the slightest idea whether, you know, 20 years later, you know, what the best thing to have happen is. So I think it's a challenging thing. I think that I think the concept of things which are just outright diseases, yeah, I think that seems like a win, but there are just so many potential unintended consequences. Now, you know, having said that, I would not have, you know, things like genetically modified crops and things like this. There are things which are much less, well, there are things where there are many potentially unintended consequences and potentially bad things that can happen. Maybe let's not go down that path. We'll talk about that another time. There's much to say about that. Okay, just a couple more things here. You guys ask such interesting questions. Berger is asking, would I consider myself a risk taker or risk averse? I will say that from the inside, I think I take essentially no risks. From the outside, people will say, oh my gosh, you did all these things. They were such big risks. That's not how I see it. You know, when I pick some project that's never been done before and that people are telling me that project is totally impossible, I'm really fairly certain it can be done. And, you know, I have enough internal optimism and confidence that, and perhaps I'm deluding myself, although touch wood, fortunately, in the however many decades that hasn't happened very much. I think that it, you know, from the inside, there's kind of enough confidence about what's going on that I sort of create for myself, at least. Maybe it's some kind of reality distortion field, I don't know, but I don't see myself as a big risk taker. You know, if somebody says, and sometimes also there are things where I say, well, yeah, it's a risk, but, you know, I look at the downside and, you know, whatever. It's, you know, I spend X amount of money on this. It might not work out. Okay, then I lose the money. That's unfortunate, but the world will go on. And, you know, things like that. Or I spend a certain amount of time, it won't work out. That's unfortunate, but, you know, it's not disastrous, so to speak. And I suppose that's part of, you know, when I say, it's part of like, I tend to like to think about, you know, what is the worst case scenario? if I know if I know that that isn't terribly bad, then, or I convince myself that there's a way that that can, not be disastrous, then that's another reason why it doesn't feel like such a risk to me, because, looking down, I'm not seeing the giant chasm of horror, so to speak. I think that people who sort of, for example, I would, as I say, the things I do, I tend to feel are kind of there's a path, I know what to do. Now, I know when I actually look at what I've done and I look at other people try and do such things, I can see that often the path that I originally took isn't the path that ended up working out. There had to be a bunch of mid-course corrections. And and this is an issue with delegating things, if you just say to somebody, just do this. Well, if I were doing it, then I know I could just have in my mind, just do this. But somewhere I'm going to hit this bump. And I'm going to say, well, actually, I know immediately I'm going to go off and do this instead. I just did something this last weekend, actually. There's a project that for 20 years I've been trying to get. It has to do with my personal people database, contact database type thing. It's been built and rebuilt multiple times, and it keeps on not really working the way I want it to work. And I finally decided, look, I'm just fed up with this. I'm going to do it myself. And it took only a few hours to get really a long way. Of course, in a sense, it's and why was that? Why was it that I delegated this to good people and they'd managed to not succeed in delivering things? Well, the reason was you get into, I'm trying to munge this, 30-year-old contact database type thing. It's got all kinds of data. It's got all kinds of fields that were put in there that seemed like they were a good idea, like, things about, I don't know, fax numbers, and that maybe that still works for some things, or things about, I don't know, other kinds of things that just aren't part of the modern world, so to speak. There are a lot of detail, a lot of things like, it was set up in a database, so it had fixed numbers of this person can have up to 3 email addresses. Well, what did they have 4? Those kinds of things, and technology restrictions of that type. And what I realized as I was kind of working on this is every 3 minutes I was making some judgment call decision. And if I delegated this task, as I had in the past, it's like, I don't know how anybody would have figured that out. Like realizing, I'd looked at how much data I have, like I think 9,000 people in this database. And it's like, okay, how many times does the following thing show up? There are only some number of, I forget, some of the areas, but there are only 5 of these things. Let me look at a couple of them. They're irrelevant. They can be merged with something else. Okay, I can get rid of that piece of this whole structure. Or other kinds of things where I'm prepared to make the judgment call, but somebody I've delegated it to is hard pressed to make that judgment call. Does it matter if somebody has some? Does it matter that we store information on the salutation for the person that you typically have in a contact system? No, I don't care. I'm never going to do something where I want to say, dear so-and-so, and know what that should say. I'm never going to generate mail like that. So I can just drop that. So I don't have to worry about how do I process that for a bunch of non-standardly configured names and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, again, it's one of these things where as presented to somebody else as a project, it's like a bit of a fragile thing, because you have to get it exactly, can I spec it exactly right? Well, no, I can't, because it depends on what's actually there in the database. It depends on things that I only think about when I see, this is what it means when there's this particular field there. Do I care about that? Well, I can make that decision based on, because, but it's hard for somebody it's delegated to be able to do that. Let's see. Okay, I should probably wrap up in a moment here. But you guys are, somebody is asking about books on the bookshelf. My gosh, I have to go look around here. A book, okay, a red book. That is a grammar of the English language. for some reason, these books sort of move around over time. And right now, this whole cluster of books is related to a project that I'm hoping to do soon, which is a project on my symbolic discourse language, trying to have a computational language that sort of expresses everyday kinds of discourse. And so there are a bunch of books about artificial languages and the construction of languages and linguistics and so on. This place where I'm sitting is a corner of my sort of office where I work most, well, essentially all the time. So this is a one of the bookshelves there that is different from I have about, I don't know, maybe 10,000 books altogether. I don't know, I haven't counted. Of course, we have them in some database somewhere. It's kind of, this is the buffer of things which are for either things I'm using right now or things that I hope to be using right now. Okay, there's a question here. Is messaging authors a good way to learn background information? From Wolfram. Yeah, I mean, I do that all the time. I mean, I think that, the thing that, if you can ask a very specific question that somebody who knows what they're talking about can just say, here's a one-sentence answer. That's a respectful and effective way to kind of get sort of good information. If, on the other hand, it's kind of like, well, I saw you wrote this book. Can you tell me what's in your book? It's like, that's a very silly piece of mail to send, because somebody is going to say, just read the freaking book. I spent all this effort writing the book. You want to know what's in it? Just read the book. So that's not a very sensible thing to ask. But I think the more specific the question, the more likely it is that you're going to be able to, get an answer, and that people are going to be prepared to give you an answer. Sometimes a question would be, has anybody ever, here's a question. Has anybody ever thought about this question? You can get answers to that. People will sometimes know. People will sometimes not answer because they say, well, I don't really know. I know I don't know, but I don't know whether nobody knows. And so if you can get an answer to the I don't know question, I have to say I'm sort of amused. I have friends who are rather, in some cases, well-known pure mathematicians, okay? And I'm always amused because I'll ask them questions. There's all kinds of math stuff I want to know about and so on. And it's sometimes amusing because a very common scenario is you ask the question, okay, silence, person is thinking, they're thinking, they're thinking, they're thinking. Then they answer, I don't know. It's like there's a long process of thinking, but then it's, I don't know. And I realized that for people who are very precision thinkers, for example, in pure mathematics and so on, for many people, it's like if you don't hit the target, they don't know. It's like, it's not, well, I know something that's nearby and this is vaguely relevant and so on. It's like, if you're a precision thinker, if you didn't absolutely hit the target, the correct answer is, I don't know. And so that's a thing where, again, if you are, it depends a bit. And sometimes also you have to realize that if you're dealing with a field that you don't know very well, sometimes what I find is there's a certain way of talking and thinking about things in different fields, and I've tried to learn it for many different fields, but there's always ones that I don't know it for, where, in that field, it's like there's just kind of a way of talking about things. And if you say things, if you ask things in a way that doesn't fit into that way of talking about things, people in that field will just be like scratching their heads, and it's like, I don't have a clue. I don't know what this is about. I mean, it would be, I could give analogies here, but probably not very useful because it depends. You have to know these different fields to know. It's just like, if I look at something that is supposed to be a physics paper, let's say, I can kind of tell immediately whether it is in the kind of, in the culture of that particular field, independent of the content. Is it culturally connected to that field? It could have great content, but be presented in a different way, although that's comparatively rare in a field like that. All right, I think I should wrap this up, even though I would love to answer more of these comments and questions. I think Erin is commenting about podcasts and saying that they liked my podcast with Lex Fridman. Were those podcasts also helpful to me in some way? You know, part of the reason that I do live streams like this and I do podcasts with Lex and things like that is, you know, people ask all kinds of things that cause me to think about stuff. And, you know, I find it useful to try and talk through some of these issues. I mean, when I'm answering questions here, I'm often saying things, I'm often expressing thoughts that I have never verbalized in any other context. And by verbalizing them, I understand better what I have to say and what I think about things. And I often figure out things. And although I'm not kind of tagging it because it would just be very confusing for people, it's like I'm realizing sometimes when I'm answering these questions and making these and having these discussions, that it's like, oh yeah, I just figured out something. I never figured that out before. I never figured out that way to explain this or that thing or whatever before. I never figured out that that was really how I felt about that particular thing before now. So yeah, it's useful. And I'm not a huge expert on all these different podcasts, but you know, Lex Fridman, for example, does a great job. He's a very excellent interviewer and discussant. And I think I'm definitely up for other things like that. All right, I should wrap up. As a matter of fact, I should give a little commercial ad for another live stream that I'm doing today, which is about the History of Math project that we've worked on with the National Museum of Mathematics. I'm kind of going to talk a little bit about some content about history of math, and I better go figure out what I'm going to say there. So thanks for joining me here, and we'll do this again another time, probably in 2 weeks from now. So thanks for joining us, and bye for now.